You're listening to 13 Past Midnight with Steve Stockton.
Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. This is 13 Past Midnight. I'm your host, Steve Stockton. Welcome back. I hope you're as excited as I am. Tonight, we have Sysco Murdoch's return. Sysco's an author, storyteller, raconteuse extraordinaire, and she's back with part 5 of her series. Ladies and gentlemen, I present for you The Strange Case of Cabin 22, Part 5, On Sacred Soil. Let's listen in.
You are listening to The Strange Case of Cabin 22, Part 5, On Sacred Soil. Original story by Sysco Murdoch. Greta and May poured more hot coffee for the fellas at the picnic table under a grand oak filled with the oranges and yellows of fall, and it was just outside the little general store at the lodge. Sheriff Cook was leaning into a car window and talking to Joan behind the wheel. Dave could see little Jacob still wrapped in the silvery EMT blanket in the back seat with his brother. Rage sat right next to the bench Dave was sitting on, and he was enjoying one of May's peanut butter dog biscuits. Dave looked over his coffee cup at the scene and couldn't get past feeling how very grateful he was to see both boys with their mom, who had elected to take Jacob to his own doctor for a checkup. "He has been through enough. I'm taking him home," she had said, and not an adult in the circle back at the cave site had disagreed with her when she said it. "The boy looked plumb spent," Chuck had said, and Dave agreed. "Damned if he didn't," he had said now, almost breathlessly. The adrenaline at that point had pretty much left his body, to the turbulence of the memories of the things they had seen. Dave hated that part of the job, but he loved this side of it. The helping part, the reunion part, the saving who he could part. Sheriff had said the crime scene was self-explanatory and stood on its own. He had added for Chuck, Dave, and Deputy Parker that the dumb son of a bitch blew himself up, saved the county a lockup and a trial. Jacob hadn't said anything, not to the EMTs, not to his brother, Mike, or anyone at the cave. When Dave carried him down the mountain, Jacob had just put his little arms tight around Dave's neck and whispered, "She tried to take me with her. She tried to take me with her." He repeated it twice, and then nothing. Dave looked into the open car door of Joan's back seat at the little boy now, remembering. Joan was parked in front of the general store, hers and the boys' things, fishing poles, gear and all, loaded up. Greta and May had packed up the little family's things. "Quicker now, spit," Chuck had joked. Dave wasn't sure how fast that was, but their stuff was in Joan's car before they all got back down from the mountain to Hugs and all the hot coffee and pie anyone could want. Joan took her coffee to go, and Dave couldn't blame her. Right now, Dave caught a glimpse of Mike munching on a slice of maize pie, almost leaning over a paper plate, using just his hands, and Dave smiled. The smile faded quickly as he faded back to Jacob, who just leaned back on the seat and stared into whatever memory he had of his own. What did you see out there, Jacob? Dave thought to himself. Who tried to take you with her? And this thought stayed Dave's own. He couldn't think of any reason to bring it up right now. He was holding more than his share of secrets and thoughts. He and Rage had only been here barely 24 hours, and he had so many questions. It was hard to focus on them all. Dave? Dave startled back into the right now. Do you want a warmer? May stood in front of him with a coffee pot wrapped in an oven-mitted hand with blue flowers on it. Her smile was warmer than the coffee. Sorry, May. Yes, please, he said and held out his cup, and she filled it. You okay, Dave? You look a bit peaked. Yes, ma'am. Just glad the boy is okay is all. Could have been a lot worse. You boys saw some awful things out there, Charles said. I hope that little guy didn't see it too, she added. Me too, Mrs. McGee. Me too. Bubba, you want a warmer on yours? How about more pie? Bubba was on his second piece and his third cup of coffee, and this too made Dave smile. Dave saw Sheriff tap the hood of Joan's car and saw Joan hold up her hand in a goodbye gesture and caught Dave's eyes and mouth. Thank you. Dave smiled and held up a hand and nodded. Oh, you're welcome. Sheriff reached over to shut the rear door, and little Jacob jumped into action, ran out of the side door, and started running toward the picnic table. The little silver blanket flew off his shoulders like a kite that caught the wind. Joan jumped out of the car and started after him, and the sheriff grabbed her arm and said something, and Joan waited. Jacob ran up to Rage, who sat up at the commotion. The little boy landed on his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog and hugged him fully, and he whispered, Thank you. Thank you for saving me, Rage. Kissed the dog on the head, and Rage returned it with a few licks to the boy's face. Jacob looked up at Dave and just nodded to him. The little boy stood up and methodically walked back to the car, head down, shut the door to the car, and Joan got back in, and they drove off. Dave patted Rage, who moved in close to him now, and they watched the car fade down the mountain road. Bubba broke the silence. That's some dog, Dave. Yes, certainly is, May McGee added. George, his tripods and equipment finally in his possession, were leaning against the edge of the picnic table next to him. He leaned up for a better view and smiled at Dave. The gathering took on a more relaxed vibe now. They all ate more pie and decompressed, watching the ME go up the trail. Another set of deputies Dave had not met went with him, rolling in extraction gurney behind them. The EMTs had gone, no one here to be saved. Dave figured they'd need shovels to get that guy in a body bag, and he shuddered a bit and pushed his plate of apple pie away from him. He was also surprised not to see a caravan of news vans coming up the mountain, but none had shown yet, and he was grateful. He looked down the table at George, who was cheering up the table and passing around a camera, showing off nature shots and chatting about one that could be a cover candidate. Dave remembered they had an appointment to talk later. The black crud on the mirror and things George said he had heard going on around here, some of the subjects they would cover, no doubt. Dave glanced at his watch. 3 o'clock already? What a day it had been. He was going to try and hit the showers again. The muck from the cave and crawling around was getting to him. This time he'd take his 12-gauge with him. He was tired of surprises, and after handshakes and "so glad you were here's" were passed around, Dave gathered up his fishing gear that never saw water that day, and he had set the worms free, and Deputy Joe had laughed at that and made fun of him a little. He and the hero dog of the day, Rage, went back to the cabin 22, gathered his stuff for his second shower today, and thought of getting back to reading, maybe a steak for Rage, and many beers for David. While Dave was taking another shower, without incident this time, Sheriff Cook and Chuck McGee finalized things around the incident that day. The cave would be boarded up by his deputies, and the investigation into the shiners would be continued, but quiet. The state sent a few of their own men up to the cave to have a look around and to help oversee the issue. Chuck knew from experience that Skeeter Davis hung around with Jeb down at the garage quite a bit. They both lived in this area most of their lives, and it was no secret there had always been a rumor of Ezra Perkins being a shiner, but no one could ever catch him at it. Sheriff would head down there to the old garage and get a look round, Sheriff had said, and see if Tater was down there too. See if he knows anything. Chuck leaned on Sheriff's car and looked at the Ziploc bags lying on its hood. Skeeter Davis's face peeked out from inside the bag and smiled up at Chuck through red streaks made by his own blood. Chuck shivered at that and looked at the watch now, also streaked in red. "Bill, that watch!" He leaned in and pointed at the gold pocket watch in the plastic bag next to the wallet. "Can you open that without taking it out?" Chuck asked the sheriff. "Sure, Chuck. I can do better than that." Bill Cook reached into his pocket and pulled out a rubber glove, slipped it on, and reached into the bag and pulled out the pocket watch. "Can you open that?" "Why, sure," Bill said as he popped the little button on the top, and it played a little tune. And Bill started to read the inscription, "To Robert," and Chuck finished it. "Eternally yours, Susan." Bill Cook looked at Chuck with question. "You know this watch, do you, Chuck?" Chuck nodded and took off his hat, ran a hand across his forehead, and said, "That there's old Bob's watch, Bill. He never let it out of his sight. It meant the world to him. Sue gave it to him back before she died, years back. Sometimes I'd see him just sitting on a rock by the river there. He'd be listening to that little song and staring off into the woods. That's Bob's watch for sure. What would a no-account like Skeet Davis be doing with that, Bill?" Sheriff closed the watch gently and placed it back in the bag. "Well, I'm just going to have to find that out, Chuck. You call me directly if you hear anything or think of anything else." "I sure will, Chuck." And Sheriff Bill got into his car to leave. "Bill, you think that little shit had something to do with old Bill drowning, do you?" "I don't know, Chuck. Sure can't rule it out, though. We'll get to the bottom of it. Keep people away from that scene. And hold on to the cabins tight tonight. Darn kids will be stirring up stuff all weekend." Chuck laughed. "Every year, Sheriff, every year." Chuck hit the hood and waved off his friend and turned back to getting things back to a low rumble around the cabins. Jeb looked through the dirty windshield of his old truck, covered in the camo netting, and stared off into the woods. His day had started off looking at the sun come through a dirty old window this morning, and now it was going to end watching it go down through another dirty one. Not one of Jebediah Perkins's best days. He was afraid to move now. The memory of the day before echoed in his mind, and he thought about everything that happened since. The loss of his still, all that money, it made him gone now for sure. The still was his real income. Sure, he'd made some money working on cars, but he liked to take his time, work not being his favorite thing to do. He made jack shit on parts, and labor drawn out like he liked to just barely covered the rent on that old place. It was a good front, though, close to Sally and his real money. It was very possible the sheriff would be looking for him now, he thought, and he didn't know if Skeet was going to talk. If he was in trouble now, of course he'd talk. He'd be spilling all the beans right about now. Damn it, anyway. He was glad to be sitting guard on the last of Sally's best shine in the back of his truck. I got to get this stuff sold, get the money, start new somewhere else. Jesus! Jeb hit the steering wheel hard. He was darn mad he was stuck here. He was even madder he had lost everything. All he had left now was the truck full of shine, and there was cops crawling all around. He knew it. They were mostly on the other side of this part of the mountain, but it wouldn't take 'em long to stray over here, start poking around, he thought. Now he had to sit here, feeling horrible, his head splitting in half from his hangover. He pulled out an old Marlboro box with pre-rolled bugler cigarettes in it, pulled out one, and shook the pack. 4 danced in the box, and he smiled. That'd be enough, he thought, and he perked up a bit, the thought of no longer giving a shit about the mortgage on that old building being past due. Let the bank take it, he thought, and good riddance. He lit up the bugler with his old Zippo lighter and clicked it closed. This, too, had his daddy's EEP initials inscribed into the front of it, just like the flask he had emptied the night before. Jeb thought when he started new, he'd get his own damn initials carved into something. His daddy left him with years of state tax and a back loan due on that old garage, and quite frankly, he was tired of carrying that old place. He saluted nothing with the mason jar half empty now. He'd been carrying that old garage on his back since his daddy died, and it was a heavy weight. Let 'em have it, he said again. Not my problem no more. He'd have to sit here now, with nothing but some crackers and some Vienna sausages, and wait till it got dark in a place that was really starting to scare him a bit. Jeb set down the jar on the seat and hung onto the steering wheel and peered over it and looked all around through the holes in the camouflage net. He looked deep into the woods that surrounded the truck, and Jeb knew these woods well, ever since he was a kid. He also knew that there were things in these woods you didn't mess with. Heard stories all his life. Seen things, too. Once, when he was a boy, he was lying right there off of that ridge off that tunnel and saw what looked like a man walking through the back trail. If that was a man, it was a big one. He took a long drag off the bugler, and he remembered. Its head was taller than the scrub trees, and they were over 7 foot tall. At first he had thought it was a bear, but a better look through the breaks in the trees told him that weren't no bear. It was covered in a grayish-brown fur and took long strides as it walked with its huge head held down, and little Jeb then saw it was dragging a buck behind it by the back hoof. That was the second day of the time he had hid out in the caves after his daddy had beaten him. His stomach ached so bad, just laying on the cool slate rock had helped him. Then he saw this hairy man, and it scared him. He had wanted to go home and tell his daddy, tell him to get his gun and go see. But he knew it would just get him a beating again, and he kept his mouth closed. He had looked through books at his school's library, always keeping those books hid behind others he had never intended to read. One day he turned a page of a book. Unexplained Mysteries, Your Guide to the Odd and Unknown, the title had read. And the page had a black and white drawing of a tall, hairy man someone had seen out in Tennessee. They called it a Sasquatch. And the picture and the name had sent a shiver down his 9-year-old spine. He kept that book, never returning it, and took a hard punishment for the $5 fine it had cost his mama to cover the loss to the school. He begged her not to tell his daddy, and she never did. And he felt bad he had lied and told her that he had lost it. Jeb had been scared his daddy would find that book, and he wrapped it in one of his old mama's dish towels and buried it in the backyard under the big rock by the pear tree that bloomed white every spring. Twice in his boyhood he had dug it up just to look at the picture and tell his young mind he hadn't been as crazy as he thought. The book told facts about the creature, too, that they would bang on trees with branches or throw rocks, and had a real sad wailing, moaning sound when they called out to each other. And sometimes he could hear wailing sound coming through the trees. It echoed off the rocks and scared him to death every time. It sounded kind of like whales did. He once caught a show on the TV. The narrator on the show said whales made that sound when they talked to each other. And the sound just like what he had heard. Only the ones he heard seemed sadder somehow. And Jeb had wondered if the big hairy Sasquatches talked to each other in the night in these woods, too. Of course, that would mean there was more than one, and that scared Jeb even more. These woods had showed him things he had never wanted to see, and for the most part, he'd figured it was part of the way of things. He did his best to avoid the woods at night, but his business was shine, and shining was a job after all. That's why they call it moonshining. And Jeb smiled, a bit of pride welling up in his chest. Moonshining was a serious business, and he loved the chance of it all, the thrill of getting away with it, the secret of it all. He was good at keeping secrets. He had been all his life. But no matter how hard Jeb tried, he'd never been as good at keeping secrets like these woods were. They held on to their mysteries well, and just sometimes you'd see just a bit of a glimpse of it, of something that was so scary it kept little boys and men alike awake at night. And now he was sitting plumb smack in the middle of them. Jeb leaned back in the seat, pulled his hat down over his eyes, just not wanting to see any more, smushed the cigarette butt into the truck's ashtray, and slid down into the seat. He planned on getting a little rest before his big drive-off escape tonight. He'd hoped that the cops would be gone before he tried to get down the dirt road and away from this mountain and off to freedom. Jebediah Perkins whispered to himself, so quiet he almost didn't hear it himself. It just can't get any worse than this. And he slowly drifted off to sleep. Sheriff Cook leaned on the workbench on one elbow, drinking a bottle of Stewart's root beer. It was cold, and its brown glass took on just a bit of frost when he had pulled it out of the old cooler into the hotter than normal October sunlight. He had just the right sweetness to it, too. The vending machine outside of Perkins' garage was an old one, the kind that you could put the money in the side slot and just lift the top off the old cooler, reach down into the cool space, and pull out an ice-cold cola. Of course, around here, that could be a bottle of Coca-Cola, a Sprite, a grape knee-high, or Stewart's root beer. People just said cola or diet for soda and went on to the specifics from there. Bill Cook could remember way before he was sheriff, way before he was ever a deputy, way before he ever graduated high school, played football, or kissed a girl. Way back when he was just a boy. He'd come up here with his daddy when Ezra Perkins ran this garage. His dad never liked Ezra Perkins, but he knew a lot about Ford Mustangs, and his daddy had one. And he had a way with getting their engines to run smooth, as Daddy had said. Back then, his dad would flip Billy a quarter, and he'd go out there, get the old wood crate, stand up on it, and pull a bottle of Coca-Cola out of the cold cooler. On a hot day, he'd linger there, his top half leaning in the coolness of the box. He got yelled at more than once by that old Ezra himself for letting out the coal. He could also remember how the green glass bottles looked just like the figure of a woman back then. He'd heard later in life that that's exactly where they got that from. Funny how things are created and how quick things change. Now a bottle was $1.50 if you were lucky, and most of them were plastic. Some of them were still glass, but glass seemed to be going away slowly but surely, and the dispensing mechanism of that old vending machine had to be pulled out a long time ago. But that old machine kept things cold enough. Its bright blue and red Pepsi logo now faded to a powder blue and pink on the side of the big machine. Now there was an old coffee can wired to the bottle opener on the side of it to drop your money in. But nothing had changed about the feeling of the cold air in that big box, except for sure, Sheriff Cook's size. Now just a quick, cool burst of air on his face would have to do. Things changed faster than we realized, and some things stayed the same more than we appreciated sometimes. Ain't that just the solid truth? When Sheriff Cook went into the garage, he'd always buy 1 or 2 bottles, bring it in, and hand it to anyone he needed to talk to have a friendly little conversation starter, pace things out slow. It was always nice to have something in the other person's hands as well, to keep them in view, especially if you were asking things that made them feel uncomfortable, or worse yet, squirrely. It helped to keep an eye on things, an icebreaker, so to speak. One time, back in the day, he was grateful for the very first time for the glass bottles giving way to the plastic ones. He was up here as a deputy with then Sheriff Cassidy. After he himself had handed old Ezra Perkins a Coca-Cola, old Ezra didn't like a question that the sheriff had asked him, and chucked that Coca-Cola bottle right at Sheriff Cassidy's head, knocked his hat clean off, and clipped his right eye. If that had been a glass bottle, Sheriff Cassidy would have needed a couple of stitches that day. The current sheriff never forgot that, and today he handed Tater Daniels a plastic 12-ounce bottle of Mountain Dew. "Tater, that old Hampton's John Deere you're a-working on?" Bill Cook asked, knowing full well it was. Everybody around here knows everybody else's John Deeres. Tater took a long sip of the bottle of Mountain Dew and gulped hard. Yes, sir. It sure is. I'm tuning her up now. Got her all straight. Tater seemed both nervous and excited at the same time to Sheriff Cook's trained ear, and he pressed on, lifting the brim of his hat just a titch off his forehead, a tell that meant he was officially on business now. That's a big job, Tater. Looks like you're doing fine at it, though. Where's Jebediah today? Shouldn't he be here helping with that? Tater got visibly more nervous now, took a long swig off the dew with a greasy rag, and with the other hand, he wiped his forehead. Oh, I got it. Tate pushed out, almost saying it all, talking around the green plastic bottle in his mouth. Jeb isn't feeling too good today, Sheriff. Is that right? Sheriff smiled now, pretty much getting the whole picture played out in front of him. If Jeb left Tater to work on a job for Farmer Hampton, who was a man finicky about his equipment and had a tight hold on his wallet, something awful important had to be pulling Jeb away from overseeing this job. Sick, is he? That's terrible, Tater. You let him know I said I hope he feels better. He must think an awful lot of you, helping to keep the place going. Tater smiled, and his body language echoed the feeling. He said he knew I could do it. He's my friend. Tater smiled again. I'm sure you have more friends than you know up here, Tater Daniels. You should know that, Sheriff added. Tater thought and looked down. Cook noticed that. Not too much passed by Sheriff Cook. You do know that, Tater, right? You can always come and let me know if there's a problem, or tell Chuck McGee. Chuck and May have always been there for you, right? Tater hung his head down a bit more, and in someone who had a heart as big and somewhat clumsy as Tater Daniels, it was a sound tell of guilt or shame. Tater was slow, but he had never been ignorant. However, Bill Cook knew he was easily influenced by those more crafty and ill-driven. Tater answered, They treat me fine. Pay me good, too. May makes the best pies, and sometimes she makes a cherry one just for me. Tater smiled big now and bounced his leg like an old hound wagging his tail, Bill thought, and chuckled a bit. Yup, they're both good God-fearing people, and they think a lot of you, Tater. Tater obviously thought on this, and the smile waned a bit. Bill caught it and thought he'd have to rattle around in Tater's head a bit more to find out what he felt guilty about where the McGees were concerned. Right now, he needed to focus on Jebediah Perkins, and did so. Jeb in his cot in the back, is he, Tater? You don't think he needs a doc, do you? Sheriff leaned up off the workbench a bit and took a step, like he himself would check in on Jeb in the back room of this garage. Tater stood up fast, knocking a screwdriver into the floor with a metallic click, and Bill Cook was no longer focused on the plastic bottle of Mountain Dew. It was the 1 3/4-inch wrench Tater gripped in his left hand that caught his full attention now. Oh, no. He told me not to wake him up. No new calls today. No new business today. He said, he made it clear he did. He's feeling real punk, Sheriff. Been puking all night, he has. Can't keep nothing down. Sheriff Cook pulled his tan Stratton cowboy hat down over one eye. His signal, his business was pretty much concluded here. Well, that sounds just awful, Tater. Must have got a hold of some food poisoning. He leaned back on the workbench to help settle Tater a little bit. Or was he a bit too far in the bottle, do you think? Tater looked down and thought a moment, and satisfied with an answer, he offered it. I think you're right, Sheriff. Got a hold of something bad he ate. Probably that potted meat we shared yesterday. I told him it tasted expired. Sheriff grinned a bit now. You get sick too, Tater, did you? Sheriff asked, feeling like a man on the control end of a fishing pole, just jiggling the tip enough to wiggle the bait just right. Tater's muscles relaxed a bit, showing he didn't think this one through as good as he had thought. No, sir, I feel just fine, he admitted and sat back down. And right there, Sheriff had the period on the sentence. He tossed the bottle of root beer back, finished it, and made a clean shot into the old metal garbage can halfway across the room. It made a loud metal-edged bang when the glass bottle hit, and Bill Cook cocked one eye past Tater at the back room door that led to where Jeb's makeshift bedroom was, and listened for the squeaky springs on the old cot, or a resounding, "Shut the hell up out there, Tate!" But nothing came. Sheriff Cook didn't think it would. Bill Cook, however, hoped against hope it would. Bill never wanted to believe in the bad in humankind. Sheriff Cook saw it every day. He was damn sure now Jeb wasn't there. He didn't even need to look, and chance signaling Tater that something was up. Best to just let it lie for now. I bet he is damn sick, though, Cook thought. The lawman kicking in strong now, stepping up front and center in his mind. Sick about the trouble he'll be in when he got linked to that still and all those years of selling illegal hooch out there. Law was law, and this time he would prove Jeb had a hand in breaking it. Done here for now. Tater, it's been fine catching up with you. I'll let you get back to work now. You let Jebediah know I would like to talk with him when he wakes up. Tell him that, all right? Sheriff Bill made his way toward the door, and Tater answered back, I sure will tell him, Sheriff. I'll tell him. Thank you kindly for the do. And he held the bottle up to emphasize the gratitude. Tater watched the sheriff leave and almost collapsed with relief. Stay out of trouble now, Tater, he called back just to jerk him up once more. And Bill walked out into the gravel parking lot. Sheriff Cook did not get back into his patrol car. He walked around back of the garage to look to see if Jeb's old truck was there, and to his surprise, it was. The old green Chevy was parked cattywampus by the back entrance. Of course, with all these vehicles at his disposal, it didn't mean that Jeb wasn't off in one of those. But there was something else that got Sheriff Cook's attention, something funny about the side of this beautiful old truck. There were huge gashes along the passenger side that went from the side door all the way down and across to the wheel well in the back of the truck. Sheriff Cook walked up to get a better look to see if maybe Jeb got in an accident of some sort, and maybe that's what was keeping him holed up in his cot all day. Maybe he was hurt and down at old Doc Clemens, or maybe at the ER. This didn't look like an accident, though. It looked like maybe he got too close to a branch along the wood line up one of the back roads. Probably drunk, he thought, and lifted up his hat mindlessly. Closer inspection showed him it didn't look like that at all. This looked like claw marks. Claws that seemed at least 3 times the size of his own hand. Cook had big hands for any man, and he laid his hand up against the door, took out his old flip phone, and snapped a few pictures. It truly was at least 3 times the size of his own hand for sure. Sheriff Cook looked down, and he knew that was trouble. What kind, he wasn't sure. A bear, maybe? Something else he had to look into now, and he headed back to his cruiser. Sheriff thought long and hard on the way down the mountain. There had been a lot going on that day, and he had a lot to sort out. He would call Chuck McGee when he got to the office, let him know to be on the lookout for a rogue and angry bear, or anything rogue and angry tonight. Tonight, after all, was Hell Night, and it was off to a great start. Used to be, when he was a boy, it was called Mischief Night. Just kids throwing eggs at cars, or soap in windows, or TP in their teacher's yard. That was the norm when he was a kid. Now, as a police officer, it was pure hell for him and his staff, and it was just getting started. Greta helped May put up the leftover pie in May McGee's perfect little country kitchen. Greta scraped pie crusts and left behind pecans and chunks of apple onto a plastic platter May had set there. "For scraps," May had said. Greta had known for years nothing went to waste around May. "There's always a creature outside that'd be glad to have it," she had heard May say more than once. They made small talk as she went through the paper plates and scraped them off and tossed them in the trash. May wrapped up 2 pieces of her best pecan for Greta to take back to the cabin with her and George. "Those sure were beautiful pictures George got this morning. He has a right good shot at the cover this year, Greta." Greta smiled. "Either way, he has a place for them on the wall at his office at home." She has always been proud and positive where George's hobbies were concerned. "Nice to see some beauty come out of that horror today. It's a blessing Anna May and Bert Davis aren't alive to see such an end to their son." Greta nodded and understood. "He'd always been hard on his mama's heart growing up. She used to sit right there on that couch and tell me of the fears she had about her boy. Truth was, I don't think Bert gave much hope for his son. But Anna May never stopped praying for him." Greta nodded again. She never knew Anna May and Bert well, only meeting Anna once before she passed up here in the lodge it was. They shared sweet tea and May's butter cookies on a hot July afternoon years back. Greta was just so grateful George and the little boy was okay. She added her thoughts to the conversation. "Deputy Danker says that Still had been up there a long time, they thought. It's a wonder no one else got hurt up there." She shook her head. "I don't wish anyone harm, but that man had to know it was dangerous as well as being illegal." May said, "Ain't it so?" and passed another plate to Greta to scrape off without looking. "Here's the last of it, Greta." Greta didn't answer. "Greta, here you go, hon." May looked toward Greta and noticed she was gripping onto the counter. Her head was starting to lean back and her eyes were rolling back into her head, and she started to sway. May quick jumped up behind her friend, threw her arms around her to brace her fall, and slowly started to ease both of them onto the tile floor as she started to yell for Charles and George, who were outside trying to talk about the day's events. "George! Charles! Come quick! Greta is having one of her spells!" Chuck heard it first and broke into a run. "George, it's Greta!" George was right with him as they ran into the office, ringing the bell on their entrance. "Back here, Charles!" May yelled, now sitting sprawled on the floor with her friend's head lying in her apron-covered lap. The men ran into the kitchen and saw the scene. George calling to his wife, "Oh, no, not again. Is she okay? Did she fall? Did she hit her head?" May said, "No, I caught her, but she's definitely having one of her spells, George. Charles, get some cool water and get me a cold dish towel over there." She nodded towards the kitchen sink. Chuck did as she asked and handed it to George, who placed the cool towel on her head, saying, "Don't startle her. She has to finish through." May said, "We remember, George. It's okay. We're here." Greta whispered something low. and Chuck leaned in too, and oddly took off his hat and held it to his chest. The four actually looked like they were conducting a prayer circle of some kind, perhaps a revival of a soul struggling not to be damned for all eternity. George lightly took her hand, and Greta's whispers turned harsh and low. A man's voice was coming from her now. It sounded like cigarettes and low-shelf whiskey. It came forced and hard, yet pleading. "He killed me. Murder. Give it back." Mumbling incoherent, George asked, Who is this?" "Give it back. He took it from me. Murder. Why?" Came the same voice again. May looked up at Chuck, and he pulled up a chair, sat down, leaned low and quiet, and spoke kind and direct to whomever was speaking through Greta. "Mister, who are you? We'll do our best to help." "Give it back." What did he take?" Chuck edged on. "Suzanne. He took my Suzanne." Chuck's eyes were the first to widen in surprise, followed by May, then George. A surprise round robin, so to speak. May covered her mouth with her hand, and Chuck continued to be the speaker of the group. Bob, is that you?" He gripped his hat tighter and leaned in a little more. Greta's body lurched a bit, and her head shook a yes, as best as it could cradle in May's apron. "Oh, Bob," Chuck answered, as his heart sank a bit. "We are so sorry. Who, Bob? Who did this to you?" Chuck asked the question, but had a darn good idea. He just didn't want to say it now, not without further information from the sheriff. Greta's lips were forming words, but no sound came from them. Chuck scooted his chair closer, his bad back only allowing him so much distance. "Bob," he repeated, "who did this to you?" Greta's hand pulled from George's gentle grip, and in one motion grabbed a handful of Chuck's red checked flannel shirt and pulled herself to a perfect sit-up and wound up inches from Chuck McGee's face. Chuck's eyebrows went so far up his forehead they almost touched his hairline. Greta's eyes rolled down to meet his, and for a moment he felt he was looking into the eyes of a man he had seen lowered into the ground at the Seven Pines Southern Baptist Cemetery just months ago. A small, surprised burst of air came from Chuck's throat, and his dead friend inside Greta spoke again. "Murder. Danger. Rougarou. Rougarou." Greta let go and collapsed back onto May's lap as fast as she had sat up. George gently gave her little slaps on the cheek and called to his wife, "Greta, it's over. Wake up." Greta fluttered her eyes and started to stir, and May replaced the cool rag on her head. Chuck met May's eyes, and he sat back, slapped his knees with both hands, and said, "Well, that cinches it. I knew it weren't no damn accident. Poor Bob. I'm so sorry, my friend." He looked down and shook his head, placed his hat back on, stood up, and replaced the chair. "Well, let's get her up and on the sofa, George." They got Greta up and together placed her on the couch. May got a cool glass of water for her friend. Greta didn't have to ask what happened. She knew. She had no idea what she said, but she knew she didn't say it. Going into trances didn't happen often, but when they did, they were memorable for anyone around her at the time, everyone but her. By the look on the two men's faces right now, she was afraid to ask what she'd said. She sat up, took the water from May, and May sat with her. George grabbed Chuck's arm and pulled him off a bit. "Chuck, this is not the first time she has said this word." Chuck listened and thought, what was that anyway? Some kind of French? He took off his hat and literally scratched his head as he thought. I didn't know Bob spoke French. George added, "She said it last night, talking, one of her dream talks. She said it in her voice, this Rougarou, over and over. Chuck, it scared me to no end. Those are usually warning dreams or premonitions." Chuck's head was swimming, and he tried to clear it. "I don't like it, George, but I'm going to get to the bottom of it. We have got help coming for tonight and tomorrow. Let's all just stay close till we get a handle on what in the tar nation is going on around here. I got a couple of stadies up at the explosion site. 2 of my men will be pulling all-nighters out on the trails. They should be showing up any time. I'm closing these trails down early tonight. Enough is enough for one day. Word of this still blowing up, and skeet blown to all hell with it, gets out with all the rumors on top of things. Tonight will be a 3-ring circus with clowns in charge." Ting ting. The door to the front office opened, and Chuck looked toward it. There stood a young girl with hot pink hair and a ponytail on top of her head that looked like a fountain of cotton candy. She had on bright purple pants and a black t-shirt that had GHOST in white big letters written across the front of her t-shirt. And coming in behind her, walking backwards, was a boy so skinny and tall, he looked like one of those happy men outside of the Dixie Automotive in town. The ones with the air that blew its arms over its head and bent 'em over and up with an oddly happy face plastered on it. The young man was taking picture after picture as he walked, with a 35mm camera around his neck that got George's attention right away. Not paying attention to where he was going, he stumbled in past the girl and nearly knocking her down. She laughed and said, "Billy Ray, you be careful now," and blew a bubble with her gum that was as pink as her hair, and it popped with a crack, and she giggled again and sucked it back into her face like a magician's scarf trick. They both laughed, and he, too, had the t-shirt that matched the girl's. The young man held out his hand to George. "Hello, I'm Will Dunn." He looked over to the girl. "We're the Dunns." "That's my sister Carney. Have 2 cabins for the weekend? My Aunt Rose and my uncle are coming right behind us." George shook his hand, smiled wide, and pointed to Chuck. "Pleased to meet you. That's the man you want right there." Chuck raised an eyebrow and called over to May. "May!" Dave was finally back on the porch of cabin 22 with his feet up, with Rage sleeping on the deck and trying to relax a bit himself. He was trying to concentrate on the book in his hand. It was difficult, though. The scenes at the cave, though gruesome, were not at the front of his mind. It was the little boy and what he had said. It was also all the unexpected things that happened since he had been here that were hard to push away. He looked at Rage, who was sleeping heavy near him. He was one hell of a dog and hell of a friend. But Dave wished he could ask him what went on in that tunnel with Jacob. Dave took a long slip of cola he had grabbed from the store before making his way back here. He wanted a beer, but it was still early, and he wanted to be as clear-headed as possible for his talk with George. He remembered he had promised to go down the mountain to town today, and while there, look up something for George. What was that word again? He fumbled through his head, looking for the word. Ragu? No. Rougarou? Oh, no, that's not it. He shook his head. Rougarou. That was it, and he snapped his fingers. And Rage looked up. No, boy. Sorry. Go back to sleep. And Dave laughed a bit then. He would have to go tomorrow. He was tired himself right now. George, Greta, and May sat at the kitchen table now, playing a card game to take their minds off things a bit. Chuck was in his office making some phone calls. May was glad she had brought in extra weekend help. She had Thomas in the general store till close, and that gave her a bit of downtime. With a full house and all the commotion, she would need it. Elda tinged the door now as she came in the office, and May got up thinking it was another renter. All clean and ready, Miss McGee. Wasn't much to clean, though. Oh, thank you, Elda. So glad you could add that one on last minute. I do appreciate it, May McGee said as she accepted the key with the gold 19 on it from Elda. You know I don't mind, as long as I'm down that mountain before dark. May knew and nodded a knowing smile to her. Elda added, I'll be back early tomorrow to put a clean and polish on the showers in the morning. See you then, Miss McGee. May told her, Safe drive, see you then. And she hung the key for 19 on the hook with its mate, the only one on the board that had 2 keys hanging on its numbered hooks, meaning they were full to the brim. And Chuck told her to save 19, the one Joan and the boys moved out of today, for someone special. And she did. David moved to the couch with Rage and actually got a couple hours sleep. He was up now and hungry. Getting a couple of steaks ready for the grill, opened the lid of a big can of Roadhouse baked beans and intended on putting the can right on the grill. He plopped a long-handled spoon into the can. We're eating like kings, aren't we, boy? Rage wagged his tail in agreement. Rage had earned it again without a doubt, and off they went. Dave balancing the plates of steaks, a huge grill fork in one hand, a beer, and the can of beans in the other. He about had the back door pulled open, using some fancy footwork, when there was a knock at the door. Rage barked once, and Dave said, I don't know, boy. Let's go see. Dave set everything back down on the counter, and they both went to the door. He thought it may be George. It wasn't. Dave stood there, staring at a man on his cabin's front porch for what seemed like a long minute. The tall, dark-haired man looked familiar, but he couldn't place him right off. The man smiled and held up a 6 of Yingling lagers and smiled a bright smile. Thought you might be needing one of these tonight. All at once it came to Dave. Joe, what the heck? Yeah, sure could. Come on in. Rage was glad to see Deputy Parker. In civilian clothes or not, Rage recognized him right off. Hey, Rage, how you doing, buddy? Rage greeted him like an old friend, even though he had just met him that morning. What brings you back here tonight? After today, I'd figure you were knocked out by now. He took the beer from Parker and motioned him to a stool at the island counter. I was scheduled a couple days off. Sheriff wasn't feeling good about leaving things as they were today. With tonight being Hell Night, too, we were stretched thin at the station, so I volunteered to spend a couple nights here, to officially keep an eye on things, unofficially. Sheriff Cook doesn't think Davis was on his own running that shine out there. Wanted somebody close from our station just in case. There are a couple state boys up around the cave area. McGee's donated cabin for me, so here I am. I'm in 19 and thought I'd let you know where I was, you being the only other person up here at least trained with the SARS. And well, unofficially, you're here for another week. Dave was honestly glad to hear it. He wasn't settled with the things ending completely today either. He didn't know these people well, but from what he had seen, he was grateful to have another trained eye out here. Damn glad. Looks like we both got gypped on our days off. Dave held up one of the cold beers, and Joe nodded. Just one, unofficially on duty. Dave laughed and handed Joe one. I know the feeling, and popped 2 more in the little fridge. Hey, are you hungry? And pointed to the steaks, and Deputy held up a hand. Oh, no, I didn't mean to intrude. Joe saw the 2 rare steaks and looked around. Maybe there was someone else there. Dave caught the look and pointed down at Rage and smiled. He likes his medium rare. How do you like yours? As he pulled another steak out of the little fridge and held it up, Joe smiled. Medium. My wife tells me to cut down on the red meat, but I just can't do it. Dave grabbed the plate with 3 steaks on it now and said, Hear that, Rage? Steak! All 3 guys went out to the back porch grill, and Dave asked Joe, Hell night, huh? I hadn't even thought of it being Halloween tomorrow. Yup, All Hallows Eve, when ghouls and ghosties come out to dance. And Joe laughed. You know, that's just not as funny as it should be, Joe, Dave replied. He was glad Joe was here, and he definitely had a couple things he wanted his opinion on. I have a couple questions, if you don't mind. Dave eased in careful. Fire away, Joe said, and lifted a salute with his beer. Dave smiled as he threw the first steak on and moved it around with a huge fork. How are you with the weird and woo-woo stuff? Officially, it depends on the evidence and the facts, Deputy Joe grinned. Unofficially, I have definitely seen some shit. Me too. Quite a bit here lately. The 2 men talked quite a while and took turns on exchanging exclamations like, Oh man, that's nuts, or how do you explain that? When Dave told him about the figure in the window, Joe looked down off the railing from the porch and to each side. Highly unlikely someone could do that jump without a cable. Getting away without any noise? Not happening. Dave agreed. Deputy Joe even went in and looked at the mirror. The black goo message was still there, right down to the smudged E. When he came back to the conversation, he made a note for them to check on who had keys to the cabin, and all the logical explanations, of course. Joe added a bit of trusted information. There has always been quite a bit of talk about the woods around here being haunted. That goes back years, I've been told. It has gotten progressively worse this season. Things happen up here. A lot of people I trust can't explain. I was told Chuck McGee swears it's all nonsense. A non-believer, quote unquote, Dave said. Sure, I can understand that. He and May do their best to shut down the hype. It brings looky-loos and investigators, and the phone rings off the hook. So Chuck pretends he has never heard of such nonsense. I can tell you this, that man knows more about the supernatural than you'd believe. Well, no kidding. Dave was a bit surprised. Sure, it's one of the reasons I'm here tonight. Hell Night gets crazy in town. Chuck McGee tries to keep those who are up here safe and enjoying their vacations without people stirring up things or asking if they've seen anything going on. Trails close at dusk, and he keeps a few friends on four-wheelers out there. Had some trouble last year with a group of college kids. Man, they brought a goat up here to sacrifice in one of the caves. They stole it from a rival college, they did. Had red paint, no stars on the cave walls, you name it. Chuck and his buddy caught 'em, though. Right after they were charged to the fullest extent of the law, Sheriff Cook made 'em come out here and scrub every bit of that paint off, too, along with all the fines they had to pay. May still got the goat somewhere around the lodge. Joe toasted to that with the last of his beer, and Dave laughed. That shower thing, though, that's strange. I gotta get Chuck on that. He really tries to keep a tight lid, like I said, on this place, but something like that Chuck isn't going to be happy about at all, Deputy Joe said, and made a mental note. Dave actually felt better now. At least they could all talk this out. I'm supposed to meet up with George Steele tonight, around 9. He said he knows some things that have happened. He wanted to tell me. I'm sure him telling me to keep it down on the down low from Chuck was just keeping in Chuck's wishes. Joe nodded. I just might join you if you don't mind. George has always been a straightforward guy. He has been here a few times when I've had to be here for disturbances and the like. Sure, please do. The more minds on this, the better. George held up his bottle and asked if Dave had any bottled water. If not, he had some in his cabin. Dave flipped a steak on the plastic plate and said sure. Not cold, though. It's in there on the counter. Help yourself. Hey, grab us some silverware out of the drawer, too, will you? He called to Joe as he walked out of view into the kitchen. Here you go, Rage. You're up first. Rage was all ears and tail wag, and he didn't need any more prompting. Dave set the plate down and patted his buddy's head. Enjoy, buddy. Joe opened one drawer and then another, and finally found the forks and knives, picked out 2 of each, and pulled the shrink-wrapped plastic back off the section of the bottled water, and heard a crisp metal snap behind him. He turned around and looked in that direction. There was nothing he could see that could click like that. He saw Dave leaning into his view through the closed screen door to put down Rage's steak, and he smiled. Great dog, he thought. I should look into getting a dog. That sound again, but this time he saw what made the noise. There was an old green tackle box on the island counter top between him and the porch doorway. He saw one of 2 lock catches on the tackle box flip open. Joe was trying to process this. Did the spring pop? What could... He stopped right there in mid-thought because the lid slowly lifted in front of his eyes. The lid opened deliberate and slow till it yawned out 2 separate trays with an assortment of contents. Dave, he managed to say slow and too low for Dave to hear, as an old wooden fishing bobber lifted itself straight up and out of the second tray. It slowly lifted, and then it stopped about 2 feet in midair, and it started to spin. Dave! Not louder this time, but actually lower in volume, as Deputy Joe Parker watched a pretty little green and red bobber and a long-styled navy and red one with most of the paint worn off slowly float up to meet the other, and also started to spin. Joe felt frozen to the spot and didn't want to take his eyes off this phenomenal sight. He found his voice and somewhere lost in his throat and pushed it out much louder now. Dave! As 2 red and white plastic round ones launched upward together, stopped abruptly next to the others, and started to dance along. Dave heard Joe, and still smiling Rage, made his way to the screen door. What's the matter, Joe? Can't find the He stopped dead in his tracks and focused on at least 8 of his dad's old bobbers dancing and spinning about 2 feet above the tackle box sitting open on the counter. He looked at Joe, then back at the odd scene. Shocked, he asked in a low voice, Are you doing that? Joe shook his head slowly no and kept his eyes on the dance. Holy shit, Joe, what the hell? Dave whispered. All of a sudden, the bobbers stopped spinning, held frozen in midair, and then flew in different directions with a force that bounced them off the walls and cabinets. As the men ducked and covered, Rage started to bark from the wrong side of the screen, and Dave held up a hand that he was okay. As he stood up, he looked at Joe, who was looking toward the front door, and pointed in that direction. Dave looked where he pointed, and his old rod and reel lifted up from its lean next to the front door. It floated up, and at the same time moved till it was horizontal and hovering over the cabin's wood floor. Rage barked again, and the catch clicked on the old brass reel, and it started to spin. It started slow at first, then sped up so fast it was a blur, and the fishing line spilled out of the sides and made what his dad used to call a bird's nest, and then it stopped dead, and the rod dropped to the floor with a loud crack. Rage barked again, and Dave reached over and opened the screen, and Rage ran in, went straight to the fishing pole and sniffed around. Dave looked around the room, waited for the next thing to come. Joe stood up now, slow, and broke the silence. "Do you do this for all your dinner guests?" Dave smiled and shook his head. "This is what I've been telling you, Joe." I can see how this could be unnerving." They both chuckled, and that helped. Joe got a closer look now and checked the box, like he was looking for strings or something, and then thought himself ridiculous. There's just no explanation." Dave smiled, trying to keep them calm. "Sure there is. The ghosties have come out to dance." Not letting this get to them, Dave tried his best to get back to normal. "Let's go try and eat. We'll go meet George, see if anyone else has seen things like this here." Joe shook his head and looked around the room. He grabbed up the silverware and his water and closed the tackle box on the way to the porch. Gave one more look before going outside. "My God," he whispered. Jeb woke up, his muscles cramping in his neck, and startled himself, recalling all at once where he was. Through the holes in the camo net, he could tell it was starting to get darker now. Just a little while longer, he thought, and I'll get out of here and never come back to this place. He was feeling closed in, and he reached over and turned down the window and breathed in the air. He looked at his gas gauge. The orange hand pointed to just a little under half. "That's fine," he said. "Plenty to get down a mountain and get off on the highway and out of here." He smiled to himself and looked over to the ammeter. "Right on 12. Okay, we could spare a little." He turned the key to the accessory, reached over and turned to the knob and the radio. It came on and blared out loud, and he jumped, quick turned the volume down and mashed the number 2 button. "Damn it, Skeet, you don't count." Tim McGraw was somewhere in the middle of "Live Like You Were Dying," and the melody filled the truck and Jeb, and he started to calm down as he started to sing. "I went 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu." Jeb was feeling better, and he had to pee. He opened the door and ducked under the camo net that made a roof over the open door and stepped away from the truck and continued to sing as he relieved himself in the brush. "Live like you was dying." Pleased with himself, he laughed, zipped up, and tossed a quick look around to the cliff and the tunnel entrance he had seen the men come out of earlier. His view in between the trees was a bad one, but he didn't see any movement, and he felt good about that. He got back in the truck and closed the door with a quiet click, and reached down and turned the radio just a bit, and he ate another cracker and slumped down low in the seat Just a little bit longer, he thought. Outside, not far away, a large beast stirred in its sleep, the low rumble of its breathing, almost a purr from its throat. The others were close too, but he slept alone. He was their leader, their wise one. He had run the long path from their true home and brought them to another. This was a good place, with high trees and hills and not too many of the intruders with their loud noises and their destruction. He had lost some in his pack along the way to the new land, but they were weak and couldn't stay close. Now he waited for nightfall. The intruder who tested him, who claimed his area with his scent, he was near. He could smell him lightly on the breeze. If he got the chance, he would not let him slip away this time. He had made him look weak to the others, like he lost his speed. He would not be tested by them. He was their leader, their wise one. No intruder would destroy his place. His thoughts drifted as he circled sleep. A low breeze blew the leaves that shaded his body, and a familiar scent, heavy with the male intruder, filled his nostrils, and a growl formed in his throat, and he opened his eyes. Like I said, Bill, Chuck finished over the phone, I have good reason to believe that Skeet Davis had something to do with old Bob's death. I can't tell you how over the phone, but you gotta keep your eye on it, and I will let you know if I hear anything else. But Bob was murdered, though. Of that, I bet my right arm on it. If I get any more information, I'll be in contact. Sheriff Cook thanked Chuck McGee and filled him in on the possible bear-attacked truck. I don't know. It don't sound right unless Jeb was antagonizing something or had food in his truck. Damn big, you say? Bill remembered the size of the claw marks and answered, Hell yeah, they're big. You just keep the trails closed down. Tell your boys on the trails to load heavy and be safe out there. Will do, Bill, Chuck agreed. You get to talk to Jeb. No sign of him yet, but we got an eye out for him. Thank you for the loan of Deputy Parker, Bill, and you stay safe out there tonight, too. Chuck hung up the phone, and Fritz, the black Persian, rubbed against the screen and blinked his green eyes at Chuck. And Chuck smiled and pet the cat. Okay, I got work to do now, Fritzy. Come on now. And hit the Google icon on his laptop. The goofy letters popped up with pumpkins for O's and a witch hat on the G. Looked like a snake was the L, and the E poofed and turned into a frog. Did you see that, Fritz? Ain't that just something? Chuck said, not a hater of Halloween by a long shot, but it sure had cost him some right good headaches in the past. Fritz tried to walk over the keyboard, and Chuck picked him up gently and placed him on the floor. "Go see if your ma's got something for you, Fritzy. I got work here to do, boy." And he smiled. And almost before he sat up, Fritz was back up on top of the desk rubbing on the screen again. "All right," Chuck laughed. "But let me type here," and chuckled. Fritz almost always won the battles anyway. Chuck typed RUGAROO and hit enter. Images of huge wolf man-looking beasts with long claws and teeth to match popped up on the screen. Fritz arched his back and hissed, and Chuck too jumped back in the seat. "I agree, Mr. Fritz." Fritz jumped down and out of the office. Chuck slowly scrolled down to some text. "The Rougarou is essentially Louisiana's bayou-dwelling werewolf and is a prominent figure in Cajun folklore." Whew. Chuck rocked back in his seat, took off his hat, scratched his head again, and whispered, "Well, I'll be dipped in shit." Then got up, opened his office door, and hollered down the hall toward the kitchen. Excuse me, George, would you like to come in here for a moment, please?" Tater had been long done with the tractor, and he took care of Mr. Hampton and his son when they came to collect and paid the bill in full. He felt good about having handled it all well, but he still felt bad about a few things. One, he had no idea what was taking Jeb so long. He promised he would not leave Tater here after dark, and it was pretty near that now. Things Tater didn't like happened here after dark, and he wasn't staying much longer. And then there was two. He had not thought of how good the McGees had been to him in a long while. He was still sad his daddy didn't count him in on the will when it came to the partnership with Mr. McGee and Mrs. McGee. His dad and Chuck McGee had owned that property together for years, and when he died, Tater had thought he could step in and be partners with Mr. McGee too. That didn't happen, and Tate was right sour over it. They let him pick any cabin he wanted, sure, for his own, and gave him the job as caretaker in charge of all the maintenance and a check every week put right into his account down at the bank. But Tater was a full-grown man and wanted a say in the camping grounds, how she was run, and to make sure the woods and animals were protected and cared for. He never said a word after the will reading. No one would have listened to him anyways. They thought he was dumb or worse, 'cause the lawyer just spoke out the words his daddy wrote, that he was trusted to them, and that meant he was dumb, and his daddy thought so too. Tater was sadder than ever after that. And now Sheriff Cook was a smart man. He had a uniform and all. And he said they thought a lot of him, and they were his friend. That made Tater think that all Jeb and Skeet had told him was not as true as what the sheriff had told him today. If they were his friends, Tater had been wrong, and he felt guilty and had to find a way to make things right again. He sat at the old desk and looked up at the dirty little window. It was getting dark fast. "Oh, Jeb, where are you?" Dave, Rage, and Joe Parker started to walk down to the lodge. It may have been too early to catch George, but they thought they would try. As they walked, the wind caught Joe's button-down shirt, and the side tail flew back a bit. For the first time, Dave noticed the strap to his shoulder holster. Good, he thought. He had left his 12-gauge at the cabin. The campers in number 20 were sitting on the porch carving pumpkins. A middle-aged lady, a man around the same age, 2 teenagers it seemed. The girl had pink hair and a tumble on her head, and waved as they walked by. Dave and Joe waved back, and they continued on to the lodge and some truth. Jeb listened to one more song till the amp meter told him he better cut her off now, or risk her not starting. Jeb thought, wrist turning the key. The old Silverado started on the first turn. "Good old girl you are." Jeb smiled and let her run just a bit. It was near to dark, and he was almost at the finish line. He hadn't seen any movement around since this afternoon, and he could chance charging her up just a bit. He had 3 crackers and 1 Vienna sausage left. He had made it through, he thought, and smiled deeper. It was getting dark inside the truck. Most of what light was left was filtered through the netting and cast shadows and funny blotches. Jeb reached another cracker and stabbed a Vienna sausage with his little pocket knife and ate them both with a new confidence that all was about to get better for him. He briefly thought of Skeeter. "He got himself in this, he can get himself out," Jeb thought as he chewed the last of his feast. "Not my problem no more." And he smiled at that too, feeling darn okay with it. Tater crossed his mind now. And he was a dumbass, but he was always there for Jeb. And Jeb thought again. "He's a big boy. He's gonna have to take care of himself too." He spoke to the windshield like it was a friend. "He's gonna be fine. I don't owe that boy nothing." Jeb took a swig of the hooch and wiped his mouth with his arm and spoke to the windshield again. "I got better things to take care of now." Jeb heard the sounds of nightfall starting around him, an old screech owl in the distance. "I might just miss these old woods." Jeb closed his eyes and listened to the woods talk to him. It took him back to being a boy again. Not the good times. There really wasn't any of those. But there were moments that were better than others. Out here in these woods, alone, had been some of his best. The bell tinged, and Rage walked in first, up to the counter and sat down in front of it, like he himself would rent a cabin from May. Fritz jumped down from the big bear statue and onto the counter and started to rub on a brochure display and figure-eighted through to a huge vase of fall flowers and then back again. Rage watched and cocked his head to one side, and Fritz just blinked its green eyes. Not a worry in his bones. The two acted like friends, Dave thought, and then called to the McGees. "Hello?" May came from the back room and looked down at Rage. Hello there, sweetie. How's our hero tonight? May came around the counter and pet the dog as Dave and Joe waited. Hello, Mrs. McGee. George wasn't at his cabin, but his car is there. Have you seen him? He and Greta are right here, boys. 1 second. May called back to Chuck. Charles, Dave and Deputy Joe are here. Chuck McGee stepped in the hallway and hollered to Joe and Dave. Hello, boys. Would you mind coming on back here just a moment? If you don't mind. All three stepped into Chuck's office and saw George behind the desk, reading something on the computer screen. Hey, Dave, I'm thinking we have a lot more to talk about than we did this morning, Chuck said. You can say that again. Boys, we got some things to tell you, and it ain't sounding good right about now. Chuck motioned them to come around the desk, and they both did. Joe's eyes widened before Dave's did, but Dave wasn't far behind. Dave let out a quiet, "What the hell?" and Joe echoed it with a slow and low whistle. George looked up at Dave and said, "Rougarou," and nodded his head. Tater had had enough waiting and thinking. He locked up the shop and put the key in the old wheel rim by the tires at the back door. It was late, and he guessed he wasn't having no pizza tonight, nor a six of beer with his buddy. He'd go by the general store. Tom was there tonight, and he'd get him some hamburger and talk with Tom a bit. That's what he'd do. He liked when Tom filled in. He was a good storyteller and a nice man, and he just couldn't wait. It was darker now, and he said he wouldn't be here in the dark. Tater walked over to his golf cart and got in. He was still mumbling on about Jeb not coming back. He had done his bit, did a good job. Now, here he was, alone in this place, and he hated it. He started up the little cart, and off he went through the gravel parking lot. He loved this old vehicle. It was one his dad used around the cabin grounds. She was a Cushman, a 735. She didn't have breakneck speed, but she handled well and took the trails like a dream. His dad got it in the 70s, and Tate loved to ride in it with him. Tater was afraid he'd keep growing and not fit under its little roof one day. But he could fit if he scrunched down a bit. Right now he was feeling as faded as her turquoise paint looked. But they both pushed on. He rode past Jeb's old truck and winced at the marks there. That ain't no branch. Those look like claw marks. It made Tater's skin bump up. A bear or something bigger, he thought, and this made Tater's head hurt. He turned and went the other way to avoid having to ride past it up close, and rode in between the farm equipment instead. Then his cart started to sputter. And quit right there and roll to a stop. Oh, no. Gas, he thought. Oh, no. Jeb made me so worried I forgot. He thought a moment and tried not to panic. He squinted his eyes and started to count. Inside his head to calm himself. 1, 2, 3. His eyes flew open. No problem. There's a 5-gallon jug back in the garage. I got it. No worries. Tater, you're fighting everything right today. And he complimented himself for fixing another problem. Got off the cart and walked back. Took the key back out of the rusty rim, unlocked the garage, and got the jug of gas from the workshop. He avoided looking at the truck as he walked back to the cart. Forgot the key and said, "Oh man, Jeb would get me sure." Turned back around and dropped the key in the rusty wheel rim. There, no worries. He took off the cap and poured in the gas, and he heard the wind whistle behind him. And a ball wind kicked up the leaves, and Tater turned around. He had stopped a full view of the dead children's playground. He was just this side of the rusty chain link fence. Oh no, not here. I hate this place. He hurried and spilled a bit of gas. The wind again. I won't look. I won't turn around. Tate whispered out loud. He usually avoided looking at that darn playground. The cars and equipment usually blocked his view. But he could see it now. He could see it now for sure. Tate shut his eyes and counted. 1, 2, 3. It's just the wind, just the wind. He dropped the gas can and let her spill out. Turned and jumped into the cart and turned the key, and it sputtered and nothing. Tater did look up then to see how far he was away from the fence. It was right in front of him, the old rusted chain link, and behind it he could see the old wooden seesaw slowly moving up and down, up and down. No, come on now. He tried again, but almost. Come on. Tater looked again, not really wanting to. He saw the old wooden plank swing start to swing all its own, up and back, up and back. It's not real. It's all in my head. Tater hoped and tried again. The cart coughed and caught, and Tater threw her in drive. And as he went way too close to the rusty fence, he saw the tilted merry-go-round start to turn and squeak as it did. And Tater put his foot down and went as fast as she would go, mumbling, "It's not real, it's not real." And where the gravel turned into the dirt road, he could swear he heard a little girl laugh. Well, we have us some serious issues here tonight, boys, Chuck said. Let's go outside to the fire pit round back, and we can continue this conversation. I don't want the ladies hearing all this, at least till we get things sorted. The men, each reading the Wikipedia version of the Rougarou and other sites' views on the subject, had their own thoughts to the matter. Deputy Parker, not one to say there weren't things in nature that made us question our sanity sometimes, but he wasn't jumping to any conclusions either. Dave was about there with him, but had seen too much in the last day to question much. George, seeing things over the years himself, knew when information came through Greta, there was a reason. and Chuck was right there with him. Chuck McGee said, "Either way, he is bringing his shotgun to the fire pit with him. Period. End of story." They went outside and started a fire, and Dave started the ball rolling. He told all of them all he had seen, from the cabinet doors being thrown open, the horrible smell in the cabin, and he added in the black mist he and Rage had seen too, even though he wasn't completely sure what that had been. The two that bothered him the most being the large black thing in the window and Rage cornering something Dave couldn't see in the back bedroom that left a very cold spot on the wall and a foul smell and a shiver down himself for sure. He showed Chuck the black goo he had saved in the cardboard, and George told Chuck about the shower and the substance left behind that seemed like motor oil, and it definitely not being the same as the goo on the mirror. Chuck surprised them with a similar story from a former renter. He had refunded their whole week's rent and put extra lights in the showers. That renter, too, had seen the large black hand in the men's shower grab his own ankle. Chuck said, "I thought they'd lost their damn minds." Dave threw in the screams he had heard that seemed to move so quickly from one point of the road to the next in seconds. That was probably a red fox, but at this point, I'm not ruling nothing out, Chuck said. Then came the one that sat Chuck back into his deluxe canvas camper's chair. "This voice came out of the static in my radio last night. It was deep and dreadful, and it said, 'They killed me, give it back,' and kept repeating, 'Why, why?'" Dave explained. Chuck looked at Dave and asked him to repeat it, and he did. Chuck looked at George now, and George nodded. George then explained a bit about Greta's gift and how she went into trances sometimes. He told about the sleep talks and how they told of how to find lost things, which was nice, but also of impending danger, and that was not as nice, George added. "Just before you gentlemen showed up this evening, Greta went into a trance. She spoke in another voice, one most assuredly not hers, and said very much the same thing you just said, David." Dave sat back in his camper's chair now, trying his best to process all this. Chuck broke the silence now. "Joe, I'm damn sure it was Bob speaking through Greta today. He said whoever hurt him took his Susan. Now, what that means, I don't pretend to know. But I looked into her eyes, and Joe, they were his eyes, looking back at me. Jesus help us. His eyes, Joe. Plain and simple, cannot explain it." Joe shook his head, taking it all in. "George, you heard this too?" George nodded and looked into the fire. They all stared into the fire a bit, sorting their own thoughts. Dave looked at Joe and asked, "You think this is a good time to tell them about the tackle box and the bobber dance?" Joe raised an eyebrow and motioned a "why not" with his shoulder in a shrug, and added a nod. "The what?" Chuck asked. They both told this story. The animation in both was almost humorous, and George, Chuck, and Rage listened intently with their eyes on both of them. Chuck took off his hat and held it in his hand and poked the fire a bit with a stick again. "Okay, this here is going to sound a little nuts," he said, slow and quiet, and all of them burst into some much-needed laughter. Chuck still had a smile on his face. Okay. I guess that can of worms has run all over already. He shrugged himself now. So why not? What if Bob is haunting your cabin, Dave, trying to get our attention? Man lived for fishing. Stayed in that cabin over a year. He was a big man. Could have been his ghost you saw at the window. I'd bet my truck that was him on the radio, too. Had to be. It's just way too similar. I just don't know why he won't come out and say who killed him, if that's what happened. Joe said, thoughtful and kind of thinking very carefully about the words coming out of his mouth. Maybe, just maybe, he can't, Chuck. Who knows? But he tried to tell us about that dog thing in there on the computer. That seems to have come up a few times. It's possible present danger may take precedence over past pain. George and Dave both looked at Joe with an I'll be damned look on their faces, and a nod of that's damn possible. Chuck didn't. He sat back again, slowly eased his shotgun across his lap, and patted her stock. Well, boys, if that's true, we got trouble on the mountain tonight. And he told them what Sheriff Cook had told him over the phone earlier, about the claw marks on Jeb's truck, and how he had extra men on patrol on the mountain tonight. Chuck also let some things flow from him tonight not many who hadn't been close friends knew. He looked into the fire now and spoke them matter-of-factly. I'm calling Jake and Gray Cloud tomorrow first thing. If these things are in the woods anywhere in Alabama or Tennessee, they'll know. Joe shook his head like he was familiar with the name. You know them, Joe? Who's he talking about? Dave asked. Yes, I do. They are elders from the original indigenous people here, Coasati and Cherokee. Chuck added. They come here often and bless the grounds. Look to the care of the land here. It is sacred soil, to them and to us. Dave nodded and said, I wish more people felt that way. We keep this place as respectable as we can, but I can tell you, the things that have been stirred up here by those opening doors they cannot close has brought more trouble here than they realize. There are parts of these woods we don't go in. Uga Sita, the soil. It is sour. It is odd how the animals know to go around it. Bad things happen there. There was a man who disappeared 2 years ago, just vanished. His group said he was there, turned the corner, and then gone. Poof! Never turned up either. A woman lost time out there last summer. She was stumbling around for 5 days. We could hear her screaming right there, but we couldn't see her. We could not see her. Chuck emphasized this by putting his hat back on his shaking head. She finally showed up jabbering on about some ghost kids trying to suck the life out of her, and then just left her in that damn playground down the road. Jeb found her passed out on that old merry-go-round spinning around like a top. It'd have been funny if it wasn't so damn peculiar. Poor lady's still up in Marlboro State House for the terminally batshit crazy. Dave's mind clicked back to what Jacob had told him, and he placed this little thought in the file cabinet in his mind and filed it between WTF and quite possible, and then listened on. The cave today was not far from where that part starts. We have no trails running through there, and try to keep people away from that area with signs and danger ahead warnings, but humans can be some of the dumbest animals out there. We try to live with the nature around here. Deputy Parker shook his head. Sheriff told me, says there's more things in heaven and earth, Dave broke in, than dreamt of in our philosophy. He laughed. Sheriff Cook quotes Shakespeare? I'm really beginning to like that guy. And they laughed, and that was good too. Laughter made you feel better. It was just a fact. Chuck leaned in and poked the fire with a stick again and added, "Well, Grey Wolf and the shaman, they will know what to do. They'll come up here and set things right again. The energy is just way off around here. You can feel it on the wind. Until then, we have a long night ahead." Chuck patted the stock of his shotgun again and added, "Load 'em if you got 'em, boys. And I'll get May to brew us up some strong coffee, too. Now, tell me about this tackle box again. I mean, damn it if that isn't something." Rage looked at Chuck like he knew what he said and barked an agreeing woof, and they all laughed some more. Jeb was about ready. Almost dark enough, he thought. He'd be okay till he got just around this back part, but then he'd be on the thin dirt road that ran the back way to the garage and out. Another 30 minutes ought to do it, and he turned the radio on low. He ate his second to the last cracker and laid his head back. "You saving that for last one for me, are you, boy?" Jeb froze. He didn't open his eyes. He was used to his daddy's voice being on the inside of his head, but this sounded like the outside of it. "You're hearing things, Jeb. Get it together now." He relaxed again, and it came low and long, and indeed from outside his head. "I asked you a question, boy." Jeb quick threw his body against the door, turning as he did to get a full view of the inside of the truck cab. There, sitting in his passenger seat, was his daddy, brought to life, and holy Jesus, there he was. Jeb's muscles tightened, and he wanted to scream, but nothing came out. He managed a small whimper from inside his throat, and he blinked. Still there, Ezra slowly turned his head to face his son and smiled with a toothpick sticking out one side, held with black teeth, and stared with hollow eyes. "How have you been, son? You taking care of business?" Jeb reached behind him and scrambled for the door handle. Sounds like cries came out from him now, and he just looked at the face of his dead father, wide-eyed and in terror. He felt the cold metal finally and jerked it up and pulled to make it catch, but the weight from his body made it hard to open. "What's the matter with you, boy? Don't you miss me?" Ezra's voice sounded like a hiss, and Jeb felt the door catch give way. He fell out of the truck backwards, his hand getting caught in the netting as he tried to catch himself, and he heard his bone crack but felt no pain. He was in shock, total shock, and he scrambled to his feet, trying to still use a broken arm, as his daddy reached for him and said, "Come back! I want to talk to you, boy!" Jeb found his feet, and he ran into the woods, stumbling and trying to hold up his arm and not fall. He ran alongside the dirt road and kept looking back toward the truck. Once more heard his daddy laugh as he did, and he just ran faster. Stumbling through the thickness of the brush, he was repeating over and over, "Run, just run. He's not real. Just keep running." Jeb saw the turn of the road, and he looked back again, so afraid his dad would be right behind him. "You got this, Jeb. You just keep running." He'd get to the garage, get his truck, and the cash in the box there. He was done. Never coming back here, never coming back, never coming back. He breathed out and he ran through the bush and the thicket. Now he pushed his way through the kudzu and other vines there in the low brush, and he heard it. A slow, rumble of a growl, and he froze, stopped dead in his tracks. It came from his side, and he looked toward the sound. Then it came again, from his right this time, further off, but there. "What in the hell?" he whispered. To the left again, closer. Oh my God. He found his feet and held his arm and ran. He ran as fast as his legs would go. The bushes rattled next to him on both sides now, like something was running with him. "Run, Jeb, run," he coached himself on. Oh my God, run. He cut through the trees to his side and down on a steep ditch, and he slipped, catching himself, and his arm screamed pain up to his shoulder, and Jeb cried out, "Ah!" And he stumbled down, lost his footing, and rolled, his body crashing into the rock below. He was stunned, but pulled himself up. He heard the growl from his side beside him, and he ran. Caught the tree line again and zigzagged in and out the trees, swatting away branches with his good arm and trying to clutch his shirt to hold his bad one. He knew this place. It was his woods. He could do this. "You can do this, Jeb." The rustle was next to him again, and along his run above him. The growl was closer now, but he saw nothing. Nothing. He could see the break ahead, the woods that led to his garage not far now. He turned and went into the last leg of his run. The rustle seemed to turn with him, and the growls were closer. He could see the shop light in the distance, just past the playground. He was gonna make it. It had been long since they were able to hunt in this way. It felt good to hunt and to turn the prey, to guide the prey, to herd them where they wanted it to go. His back was so very good at the chase. It had been hard along the journey to hunt the grounds they knew. Tonight they would bring the intruder to him, and he would show them he was still their wise one, their leader. "Bring him to me. Bring him." Jeb crashed through the low brush, and he could see the light ahead. He stopped for a moment, held his arm, and looked back into the woods. He had heard nothing for a bit, and he listened now. He breathed deeply and let it out, and a clear growl came from both sides of him now, a bit off, but there. He reached in his pocket for the Zippo, maybe a bit of light to help him through the rocky hill below to the open playgrounds field. He fumbled with the lighter in his hand, and the growl came right behind him now. And the growl came right behind him now. Jeb cried out. He couldn't help it, and his feet took off, down the clumsy slope of rocks in the dark. He had done it. He reached the fence of the playground, and he stumbled through the broken mesh and slipped under the bar. The dim light from inside the garage not far off at all. "You got this, Jeb. Go." The desperate man took off across the field and ran toward the other side. He could see the silhouette of the cars and tractors not far in the distance, and he ran through the sand-filled field, around the swings, or under the monkey bars, and over the fallen fence, and cleared the fence bar and fell onto the ground on the other side. Oh, hell, man. That was awful. He breathed in deep. Jesus. That was no way. My daddy back there, no way. What the hell is in these woods? What the hell? He caught his breath a moment. You did it, Jeb. His arm banged hot with pain, and his chest burned from his run. He could barely see his hand in front of his face, and he wanted to look to see if anything followed him from the woods. He wished he'd grabbed his flashlight from the truck, but he left it behind with that thing that looked like his daddy. He pulled himself to his knees, and he lit the Zippo again. To guide himself through the junkyard of old trucks and farm equipment long silenced by time and rust. Shadows danced in the flames' light, and the field behind looked empty as far as he could tell. He gingerly made his way through the junk piles of twisted metal when he heard a low rumble come from in front of him. The skeletons of cars were between him and his garage back door. His truck, with a loaded .357 under its seat, sat even closer, there between him and freedom. A dark shadow began to move right in his path. It rose from the bed of an old pickup truck right in front of Jeb. It stood up slow and unfolded its massive body before him as the horror unfolded inside Jeb. It was the creature he had seen on the road last night, backed by the moonlight, standing in the bed of the old pickup. It stood enormous before him, and it spread its arms out to its side and let out a howl that curdled Jeb's blood. He turned to run back the way he came, and two more like this one creeped toward him across the field of the playground on all fours, each of them adding their own howls in return. The beast leaped out of the truck and landed before Jeb in one fluid movement, picked him up by the back of his shirt and lifted him off the ground. He turned Jeb's helpless body toward him, and the light of the Zippo illuminated the beast's face. Jeb looked into the creature's eyes, and he thought he saw a glimpse of sympathy there. But the beast snarled hot, foul air towards him, and Jeb started to scream again. The beast slowly reached up with its enormous claws and slowly ran them down Jeb's face, like a dad would do to a son, and with the same gentleness. Jeb had no real thoughts at this time. They were overrun with sheer fear, and his whole body trembled. The Zippo still lighting the thing's face as it shook in his hand. For a brief second, Jebediah Perkins thought the beast would somehow drop him and run off with the others, who had now gathered into the light of Jeb's flame. The wrathful beast slowly moved its claws up Jeb's face, now the other way, across his forehead and into his hair, and Jeb stiffened from its touch. It slowly raked its claws over Jeb's scalp, tilted its head, and grabbed a claw full of his hair, and jerked the man's head to one side, and bit through his neck completely as he pulled. The beast held up Jeb's head like a trophy to the others and let the body fall. The Zippo hit the ground and found a puddle of gas there and engulfed it, and the gas can left turned over, went up in flames. The flames flew up and caught one of the smaller beasts, and as Jeb's head watched on, he saw one dragging off his body as the other ran into the field, half of it covered in flames, and watched it roll around in the sand. Jebediah felt the dark close on him, and then he saw no more. The beast raised the head to the moon and howled. "Hey," Dave said. "Did you guys hear that?" Everyone stopped still and listened. A scream from far off followed the wind. "That was no fox," Chuck said. A howl from the same direction followed, and Rage sat up and perked up his ears. Then another scream, and Joe Parker stood up and turned toward the sound. That came from down the mountain, Chuck. Chuck stood up with his shotgun at the ready. Off from the other direction, a scream of a different kind echoed a wailing that vibrated the trees. Chuck knew this one well. It was the Squatch, and he was none too happy about something. Chuck had learned the sound over the years, and this was not good. Another answered back, and the men all looked at each other and around them at the same time. Rage moved in close to Dave, and Dave didn't blame him. Another scream, a blood-curdling one, came back up the mountain again, and followed by a howl the Wolfman himself would be impressed by. May and Greta stepped outside the back door and into the light of the fire pit, and they all stood a moment of silence, waiting for the next sound. "My God," Chuck whispered to the group. "Welcome to Hell Night, boys." You have been listening to The Strange Case of Cabin 22, Part 5, On Sacred Soil. Stay tuned for Part 6, the final chapter.
Wow, just wow. That is all I can say is wow. Sysco, you've knocked it out of the park, and that's not the end. Coming soon, Part 6. Watch for it. I'm Steve Stockton, and you've been listening to 13 Past Midnight.